Welcome to Reviewing the Golden Age, where we review astounding science fiction for as long as it remains astounding. Today, The Beetle Horde by Victor Rousseau.
Beetles! Giant beetles! Trillions of giant beetles coming from inside the hollow earth to devour humanity, under the leadership of a mad scientist. Sorry, I got a bit excited. Let's start properly.
In 1907, French philosopher Henri Bergson published Creative Evolution, in which he put forward the idea that evolution was driven by the manifestation of the élan vital, or vital impulse, in all living things. Why yes, we are discussing the Beetle Horde today, in which a mad scientist attempts to conquer the whole world with a giant army of trillions of giant beetles. And yes, this is relevant. The ideas of Henri Bergson were enormously popular during the early part of the 20th century. Basically, it took the concepts that Charles Darwin had put forward, but combined them with the idea that evolution has a point, an aim that represents some sort of innate drive in all life, and humanity is the final, at least so far, development of that aim, the latest development of the vital impulse.
Ultimately, the whole idea was a religious one, which was pointed out at the time by many, although its proponents were sometimes offended by this suggestion. For centuries, European civilization had generally accepted, with many variations, the Christian purpose for human existence. However, throughout the 19th century, this had increasingly come to be rejected by large parts of what we might call the intelligentsia, or the upper classes, even if, at the time, it remained the belief of a large majority of the population. Thus, having rejected one purpose, another was needed. But the world that was beginning to take shape in the minds of the intelligentsia was not one that suggested a purpose. It held that man was the accidental result of a random process, unguided by any moral or theological force. To many, this felt pointless, and so attempts were made to restore the lost purpose in a different guise.
One of those attempts was trying to let evolution, or the development of history itself, provide the purpose that religion once had. There were a lot of variations on this theme, apart from Henri Bergson's. Hegel spoke of dialectical idealism, in which human society develops by, and is the result of, continual conflicts and syntheses between manifestations of ideas developing towards the absolute, whatever that means. Marx had a more mechanistic variation on the same theme. Each of them, in their own way, granted ultimate purpose to history itself. Other thinkers extended this further back, before the origins of man. From the very beginning, nature had been perfecting itself, and man was the final product of that perfection. This was often combined with the ideas I have mentioned earlier, and communism, various forms of socialism, and other ideologies of progress were held to be the result of this process. And of course, many at the time considered themselves the agent of this historical life force, and were willing to take rather extreme actions in the service of their master. One of the loudest prophets of this idea was George Bernard Shaw, the enormously popular playwright and intellectual of the early 20th century. As he put it, "To me, God does not exist, but there is a creative force continually struggling to involve an executive organ of God-like knowledge and power, that is, to achieve omnipotence and omniscience, and every man and woman born is a fresh attempt to achieve this object."
In The Beetle Horde, Rousseau deconstructs this entire idea by asking, how do you know humans are actually the fulfillment of this eternal process of evolution? After all, there aren't very many of us. Why couldn't the conclusion of history be something else? Like beetles say. Giant beetles. Giant beetles from the centre of the earth.
Okay, Maybe that requires a bit of elaboration. The Beetle Horde was written by Victor Rousseau and is the first story of the first issue of Astounding Stories of Super Science, although it isn't concluded until the second. The story starts with a bunch of explorers in the Antarctica. The two main characters are Tommy Travers, the expedition pilot, who is also the nephew of the millionaire who is funding the expedition, and Jim Dodd, who is the expedition archaeologist. They are flying around trying to find the exact point of the South Pole, which the story informs us is unknown. When they do, they are startled to find a great hole which, upon being flown into, leads to them crashing on the inside of the hollow earth. That's right. Barely a few pages previously, we were being assured by Harry Bates that all the stories in this magazine would be strictly accurate in their science, and already we are flying into the hollow earth. Both Antarctica and the hollow earth are, of course, not uncommon in pulp adventure stories of the era. As the traditional realms of adventure and exoticism became explored, one had to go further to find the uncontacted peoples and unexplored lands that such stories require. The most well-known example today of a story of the era based in Antarctica would be Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. Hollow Earth stories are less remembered today, but at the time, Polysadur by Burroughs, who also wrote Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, was very popular. Indeed, Rousseau himself had written a Hollow Earth story just a few years before with The Eye of Balamok. Regardless, this Hollow Earth story is quite different from many I have read in that the inside of the Earth is dark. Hollow Earth stories almost always involve some sort of internal sun. In this story, however, Submundia, as it is called, is a completely black world. This aspect of the story and its depiction of the completely dark underworld is one of the better parts of the story. It leads to a few genuinely evocative passages and ideas, such as the descriptions of the adaptations of the people of the Midnight World. Unfortunately, this aspect of the story is not dwelled upon. Talking of people, they quickly encounter one of the inhabitants. Anyone familiar with this kind of story will be very unsurprised to hear that it is a woman, beautiful and savage, and that before the story is over, she will be married to Dodd. The woman, who is called Haida, guides them through Submundia after they rescue her from being devoured by a giant beetle, as is very badly depicted on the magazine cover. After a few narrow escapes and adventures, they come across Haida's tribe. They quickly discover that the tribe are the cattle of the local beetle population, who herd humans for meat and hair. After being herded around for a bit, they are brought before the chief beetle, only to find that it is not actually a beetle, but a man disguised as a beetle. It's Bram, an old colleague of Dodd's. He takes the three of them prisoner in his lair from which he rules the beetle folk. In true mad scientist fashion, he is very bitter about his theories being rejected by his colleagues, and offers to allow them to join in his plots for the human race if they will but admit the validity of his assertion that monotremes existed before the Pleistocene epoch. Dodd refuses, declaring that as a scientist he can never admit such a thing. This will become a recurring incident throughout the story, as every time Bram and the heroes meet, regardless of circumstances, Dodd and Bram will fall to quarrelling about the origins of monotremes. Bram then shows them a great mass of juvenile beetles. It turns out that these beetles are like cicadas, in that they breed and hatch in great swarms on a cycle that spans many years. The cycle covers more than a century in this case. When the next swarm hatches, Bram will lead them to the surface and destroy humanity. After some time as prisoner, the three of them make an escape. They find a way up through a network of tunnels to the surface and come out in Australia. Incidentally, Rousseau's other Hollow Earth story, The Eye of Bamalok, also had an entrance to the Hollow Earth in Australia. But soon afterwards,
Bram emerges with the newly hatched beetles to have his revenge upon the human race. Trillions of giant beetles cover the land. Thus, the beetles begin their righteous annihilation of Australia. As is to be expected, they overcome all human resistance with ease, with whole cities being destroyed. Our main three are trapped in a post office, which the beetles rather implausibly can't break into. Bram comes to talk them into coming out to keep him company. He claims he has become lonely without human companionship, but they refuse. Humanity seems doomed, but Haida is unalarmed. She cryptically says that the beetles are finished, but does not elaborate. And so they are. It turns out that as part of their natural life cycle, the beetles molt their shells and go into hibernation only a few days after hatching. When they do so, the entire plot of Bram is thwarted. Dodd and Tommy lead humanity in digging up and incinerating the beetles, and Dodd marries Haida. After some time, they come across Bram after incinerating a batch of sleeping beetles. He has been accidentally caught up in the fire, and after one last time asserting the early origin of monotremes, he dies. Dodd is slightly saddened, saying that though Bram was a devil, he had the potentialities of a god. Thus, the beetles are defeated, as were the Martians of H.G. Wells, not by any device of man, but simply by their own defective nature. The end. So, what does all this have to do with the life force? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at Bram's motive for having beetles destroy humanity. Part of it is the incredibly old, "Those fools at the Academy laughed at me. Who's laughing now?" that mad scientist in fiction have loved for so long. Also, he's described as being a drug addict. But his main motive is more interesting. He really thinks that the beetles should win. I tell you, gentlemen, that nature, God, if you will, has designed to supplant the man-ape by the beetle. He has resolved to throw down the wretched so-called intelligence of your kind and mine, and supplant it by the divine instinct of the beetle, an instinct that is infinitely superior because it arrives at results instantaneously. It knows what man infers. Attuned closely to nature, it alone is able to fulfill the divine plan of creation. This also explains why the continual debate about the origin of monotremes is actually of some importance to the story. Monotremes are the group of mammals that contains platypuses and other egg layers, and the debate between Dodd and Bram is around if these are of ancient or relatively recent origins. Bram takes this as a debate over whether they are of any importance in the plan of nature. "When I joined the Greystone expedition," he cried, "it was with the express intention of refuting your miserable theories as to the fossil monotremes. I could not sleep or eat, so deeply was I affronted by them. For, if they were true, the Deosauridia are an innovation in the great scheme of nature, and man, instead of being a mere afterthought, a jest of the creative force, came to earth with a purpose. That I deny," he yelled. "Man is a joke. Nature created him when she was tired, as the architect of a cathedral fashions a goggle in a sportive moment. It is the insect, not man, who is the predestined lord of the ages." Bram's justification for annihilating humanity is that humanity is meant to be annihilated, that history, evolution, and nature has chosen the beetles to replace them. Thus, evolution and history are made their own justification in a self-referential cycle, as so many ideologies at the time, and to a certain extent even today, did. If Bram destroys humanity, then he will have been right to do so, since he did so, and so, thus he will do so. The inevitability of actions, the fact that there is the way of the future, or the way history is trending, thus becomes the justification of those self-same actions. So, do I actually think that the Beetle Horde was an attempt to critique the ideals of creative evolution? Nah, maybe, maybe not. It certainly isn't very central to the story if it was. One could easily excise that whole theme without hurting the tale. Indeed, I can't help wondering if the original story even had Bram and all that in it. In his reminiscences about editing the magazine, Bates would say years later that the writers were mostly ignorant of science and technology. So much of what eventually got into their stories had in one way or another to be put there by myself. I spent endless time dictating letters to them, often including brief lectures on some aspect of science, or saving ideas invented at the moment. Still, it wouldn't be out of character of Rousseau to want to discuss these ideas himself. Rousseau had written many stories at this point, such as The Eye of Bamalok, the Hollow Earth story I mentioned earlier, and Jacqueline of Golden River. Jacqueline of Golden River. Just listen to that title. I haven't read it, and don't want to, since I know nothing Victor Rousseau will have written would equal the vision that those words bring to mind. But never mind that. Rousseau was a fairly established name in science fiction at the time. Of course, you have to remember that the science fiction genre was as nothing compared to its present position. And something that many of his stories have in common is a religious theme. The story Messiah of the Cylinder, which was written in response to the works of H.G. Wells, tells the story of a battle between the forces of atheism and secularism and Christianity. The villains of that story also often invoke nature, so I suspect this might be Rousseau's own handiwork. But if you don't know Rousseau's background, one could quite easily imagine that the mad scientist Bram and the debate about the origins of mammals and man were among the additions of Bates. Because this story is an almost perfect example, if you subtract those aspects, of a sort of story involving a traveller from our world to another that is repeated endlessly in early pulp science fiction and fantasy, but which I haven't been able to find a better term for than planetary romance. This is unfortunate, since not all of them involve another planet. Honestly, the phrase savage romance might be a better one, since they generally do involve an emphasis on the savageness and therefore nobility of the visited world, to which our own civilized world is often contrasted unfavourably. The genre will involve a young man who by some unlikely series of events is snatched to another world or an isolated part of our own, such as a lost continent, the inside of a hollow earth, or the tiny solar system inside an atom. There, he will invariably meet a beautiful savage girl, whom he will fall completely in love with. Also invariably, the girl's people will be oppressed or at war with some vile, often inhuman, foe. The hero will get involved in the war and defeat this foe, and often wind up some kind of king or leader amongst the girl's people. If you want a modern example of many of these stories, honestly, I think the best example would really be the isekai that dominates so much of modern anime. The most obvious writer of this story would be Edgar Rice Burroughs, who repeats the basic plot in almost all his tales, although I have found it also in The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings and many other such stories. Many of the aspects of these pulp savage romances are present in this story, especially the first half. There is the savage but brilliant love interest, the inhuman monsters that dominate humanity, and the strange journey to another world. Admittedly, the end, where the Beatles invade the surface world, diverts from this standard template. The old savage romance heroes rarely return to our world, and if they do, they often regret it, and it doesn't usually have much impact on our world. Nonetheless, this story is an interesting look, in miniature, at many of the tropes that dominate such stories. But, unfortunately, the Beetle Horde really isn't a particularly brilliant example of any of these things. Do you want a Hollow Earth adventure? Then you really should just read Pelacida, to be honest. It also involved humans being enslaved by giant prehistoric monsters. Do you just want a pulp adventure story in a savage world? Most adventure pulp novels are probably better. Do you want an actual discussion of the ideas of creative evolution? Well, the works of Olaf Stapledon give one a look from the point of view of a believer, and, from the other side, PERELANDRA by C.S. Lewis
from the point of view of a critic would both be better choices. And if you actually want science fiction with even a small understanding of science, well, this certainly isn't the place to look. This story is a lot of things, and in that respect is of some interest, but it isn't very good at any of them. Indeed, it leaves almost all its most interesting ideas incomplete. Take the whole idea of the beetles farming people for their hair and meat. That's a very creepy idea, and could quite easily be the basis for an entire story. But here, it is barely touched upon. Indeed, the whole tribe that Haida came from is dropped and forgotten once the main characters leave it. I'm guessing they were eaten by the Beetle Horde, but we never get any confirmation. One would have thought that one could at least mention Haida and the main characters being sad about their fate, but out of sight, out of mind. Similar problems are present with almost everything that could raise this story much above mediocrity. Still, I'm not sorry to have read it. It helps illustrate 2 points of note about early science fiction and pulp fiction. The first is how, even in the most commercial and entertainment-focused science fiction, we often find manifested the ideas of the society it came from, ideas that might be almost utterly forgotten today, ideas like creative evolution. It's those ideas that I would like to discuss in these reviews. Science fiction is, after all, at its best a genre of ideas, and this is true, maybe unintentionally, of even its less promising works. Indeed, the forgotten and mediocre works may sometimes shed light to the ideas of the day more clearly and honestly than the better works do. And secondly, this is the beginning, the very first story of Astounding Stories. Whatever great tales that will be told in the pages of the magazine, it all began with pulp tales like this one. And I think we may find that, whatever strange and wonderful things we will find in its pages, the DNA of its origins, in pulp tales like this one, will always remain in Astounding Stories. Plus, who doesn't love the idea of 1 trillion giant beetles destroying the Earth? The Hollow Earth.